Is KJTN place for critical rationalism for ideal natural spiritual balance? Welcome home. Many teachings have complicated the simple truths. Here, we make the complicated simple. If you know the truth shall set you free. Hello and how are you? Today let us ask this question and find answers for it. The question is, whom did Jesus pay our debts? We hear many preachers say, we were bought or Jesus paid our debts. This begs the question, to whom did he pay this debt? Was it God or Satan? William Tyndale says, Evangelion, which is also called gospel, is a Greek word and signifies good, merry, glad, and joyful tidings, that maketh a man's heart glad and maketh him sing, dance, and live for joy. End of quote. It is true that when we attend churches after or during sermons and preachings, we become glad or joyful. This is why religion has been termed as opium of the masses, because of these feelings of euphoria and high during the sermons. That is why we always shout amen and things like that when it touches our nerves. Many people do not ask important questions. Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142 AD, on advancing moral influence theory, stated in his work titled Sic et Non, which means yes and no, he says, quote, the way to reach the truth is to doubt and then to ask questions and find the answers. This, we can see, is a scientific approach. End of quote. Peter asked question, and the question was, what does it mean to say that we are redeemed by the death of Christ? Now, he ridiculed the idea that the devil has any rights over mankind. In fact, he said mankind has rights over the devil. He maintained the ransom was paid to God, who really has rights over us and the devil. Then he asked this question, why is it necessary for a ransom to be paid to God? Could he not simply forgive sin? It is not sinful to use Peter Bellard's approach of yes and no, in which you doubt and then ask questions and find answer. If you look at the wordings, it sounds like Thomas syndrome. Thomas the disciple who doubted if Jesus had risen. But this was really what the Bereans were doing. Acts 17 verse 11 onwards, the Bible reads, now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standings as well as men. The line, examine the scriptures daily to see if these things were so, shows a little level of curiosity, if not what we call doubt. The result speaks for itself, which states, many therefore believed, not just mere people, but those with high standing. The word noble originally meant of noble birth or well-born in Greek. The word was also applied to people who exhibited noble behavior, who were open-minded, fair, and thoughtful. Examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so means that every believer needs to counter-check the word versus what is being preached, because in doing so, ordinary believers or people who eagerly read the Bible diligently, depending on God for help, can understand it better. In doing this, the result can be great in terms of growth of faith, growth of church, and etc. To answer Peter's question, which was, why is it necessary for a ransom to be paid to God? we need to check the work of Anselm. The Anselm advanced a theory which stated the satisfactory theory 1033 to 1098 AD. Peter was his contemporary. He, Anselm, in his deductive approach begins with illustration of man's inability to atone for himself. He says, man owes all he is to God. If man pays what is owed to God, he would not sin. However, if you owe someone all you have and you incur more debt, you cannot pay because it overwhelms you. Man, therefore, is helpless to atone for his own sins. He has nothing extra to pay for his sins. Man has nothing. This is a doctrine of human helplessness or inability to pay. Sin, in this context, is defined as withholding from God what is rightfully his. This robs and dishonors him. As the Roman Empire got set in and a generation of Christians came and went, Roman law began to dominate not just society and education, but also the church, which became very legalistic. The sinner was metaphorically tried by the representative of the Pope. Upon confession, absolution could be pronounced because the Pope had the authority to grant it and to dispense the grace of Christ. But in a legal trial, the sinner could not go free of punishment. Hence, a system of penance and the purchase of grace or indulgence to avoid it was introduced. The emphasis was on the legal dispensation of grace and punishment. Okay? It was in this situation that Anselm pronounced his scholastic philosophy of the atonement as satisfying God's offended honor in his book Cur Deus Homo, meaning, why did God become man? Anselm asks, why pay debt? He goes ahead to answer it by saying, quote, God's honor had been offended by man's sin as a king's honor would be offended by a knight's rebellion. A knight is a soldier in those times, medieval times. A knight might offer satisfaction to an offended king by paying a large bribe, but that which is necessary to satisfy God's honor must, and I repeat, must be greater than the whole creation. And remember, all creation is God's, including man and Satan, and this all creation is already his. If God's honor remained unsatisfied, then man's soul must be left to the devil as a gazelle is left to the lion. What offering could be provided to satisfy God's honor then? We ask this. Now, humankind owes satisfaction to God. That is true. Only God is great enough to be able to pay it. So, he who paid this ransom had to be both God and man. This is the reason why God became man. The only penalty that could appease a holy God was that which Jesus paid in his own body in death. Anselm claimed that the cross was not only necessary, something had to be done to appease God's offended honor, but it was absolutely necessary. There was no other way we could pay this. He believed in an invisible kingdom of spiritual realities and a world dominated the cross. The cross of Christ. But the cross was not the place where Christ did battle against evil, but the place where God's own honor was satisfied by God's own action in God's own way. We ask this question: to whom did he pay the ransom? This leads us to to Satan theory. Many people believe this theory, that the ransom or the payment was made to Satan. But let us see what it states. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. These are what even some of the Muslims read. It's Mark 10:45, and they challenge us, if then Jesus is God, why would he pay ransom to Satan? It is not this. It is not what Jesus meant. So people misunderstand this, because if you go with this, the idea is that man disobeyed God, and in so doing, in so disobeying God, fell under Satan's power. So God must now make a payment to Satan for man's release. This implies that Satan has rights over God. Also that Satan justly holds man justly, and punishes him justly. Man, of course, deserves this punishment, if this theory is to go by. If it appears to be justice, then that demands that ransom is to be paid to Satan. If this theory is to go by, Anselm destroys the ransom to Satan theory in his book, in this first book, chapter 7. There are two presuppositions he poses. 1. Mankind deserves punishment. This is true. 2. Satan has rights over mankind. This is false. We can confirm, therefore, that if salvation does mean that man is set free from Satan's power, then God can do this by a bare exercise of his own power. There would be nothing unjust about such an act of force. Satan has absolutely no rights over God. To close up this, we can confidently assert that man has taken away from God his honor by allowing himself to be conquered by the devil. That must be restored. This must consist, therefore, in the conquest of the devil, and that implies that in heavenly commonwealth, which God has purposed, man's soul must be justified or made righteous, as would be sufficient to take the place of fallen angels. This leads us to ideas of compensation. In the process of restoration of man, it is not only what was taken away from God is restored, but more than that is restored. God incurred anguish due to this contempt. Therefore, there must be compensation for his anguish. For example, if someone injures someone else's dignity through the robbery of something ontologically essential to that person, it is not sufficient merely to pay back what is robbed, but there must also be something in addition to restore the dignity, because dignity requires compensation. Only the life and death of God, who becomes man, allows these attributes to be restored and maintained. Rational nature of man was created to love and choose the highest good supremely for its own sake and nothing else. Rational nature was made holy in order to be happy in enjoying the supreme good, which is God. In conclusion, ransom was not paid to Satan, but to God, who has everlasting right over Satan and everlasting right over us. The death of God on the cross is the supreme example of God's love, and because of it, we are able to believe God's mercy and trust his forgiveness, which awakes our response of love towards him. Thank you for listening. If you need in-depth analysis and truth, subscribe, like, and share. This Again, it's Josh Otieno. Shalom.